Hi everyone. In this episode, I am talking to Rohini, who is a dear friend and someone deeply engaged with the practice of teaching. We talk about a bunch of things in this conversation, including Rohini's work, her PhD, reflections from her teaching, and particularly ways in which we can think about the teaching of law. I hope this is an interesting, useful, and enjoyable conversation. Listen in and subscribe for more. Hi Rohini, how are you doing?
I am good. We finally managed to make time for this.
Yes, and I'm very excited to be talking to you today and discussing many things about teaching and law and other things. Let's start with an introduction. Would you like to introduce yourself? What are you up to these days?
Of course. I am currently still teaching law, and what I broadly teach is law and humanities, which is also where my interest seems to lie in terms of research. But I moved a little bit away from law in terms of teaching, and now my questions are more about what constitutes law, what are the different ways to teach, and so on and so forth. So if I was to introduce myself, I would do so by calling myself someone who thinks a lot about the ideas of teaching. And the specific window through which this thinking happens is the teaching of law, but it could be several other things as well.
Okay. Could you maybe talk a little bit about how you got here? Like what have been the steps institutionally? Like where did you start from? So you started with, of course, a law degree, and from there, you've also done a PhD. So just a little sample of your institutional journey would be good.
My institutional journey is quite incidental or also accidental in some ways. So I wasn't aiming to do law. I was aiming to do something like history or comparative literature. I ended up doing law, and I would have ended up teaching regardless of what discipline I pursued. So at least there was that clarity that this is what I would like to do. I did not take to law in the beginning. I found the language of law unnecessarily mystified. Doctrines didn't speak to me. And I think that sensibility has remained with me, both in terms of my teaching and my research. So I have institutional training in what is a 5 year undergraduate integrated law degree, but it was not very good training. And in hindsight, I do think that's a good thing because it leaves me with the opportunity to think about law, teaching, and other things in a way where I'm not influenced by anything that precedes me. So I did my undergraduate degree in one of the national law schools in India, after which I went on to do a master's in a subdiscipline called international law. Thereafter, I started teaching soon after my master's. This would be the 13th, 14th year of my teaching. And then end of 2019, early 2020, I decided to go for my PhD. By this time, my interest has had shifted from the various kinds of laws that I was teaching to what is it that we do when we say we are teaching a critical discipline. Now, what I broadly teach is called critical approaches to international law. My questions are about where does law come from, what are the various contexts, what informs it, and so on and so forth. So my PhD then became an inquiry about how teachers think about these so-called critical disciplines that they teach. The specific entry point into this conversation was critical approaches to international law, but I think my PhD has something for teachers generally, specifically for law teachers and also for international law teachers as well. So that's an approximate teaching journey.
Okay, I mean that's a lot of things, and I want to talk a little bit about your PhD and what are the different things you've explored through it. But you mentioned that this is your what 13th, 14th year of teaching now. So I would be interested to know like what got you into teaching, what motivated you to begin teaching. Was it just like one of those things that you have to do? It's one of the obvious jobs to do, or did you have, let's say, a proclivity towards it from the beginning? And as you have been teaching, and your research obviously also talks about teaching, what would be some of the things that stand out, let's say, in your teaching practice that you have, thought about deeply?
What drew me about teaching was the interface of interacting with others, discussing ideas, and so on and so forth. So I think my early inclination was towards some form of thinking, interacts with public speaking, interacts with simplifying complex ideas. That's where I started out as a teacher in terms of what I'm drawn to. Over the years now, I see teaching as a slightly different enterprise. It's my 13th, 14th year of teaching, and I would say the first 3 to 5 years of my teaching was about communicating content. And there was a lot of emphasis and focus on what is it that I'm communicating, and of course, the how as well. Over the years, however, I think I find myself shifting towards what I understand are practices of conceptual reorientation. So it's not so much how much ground I want to cover, it's the way in which I'm covering. What is the logic behind the way I'm trying to do this? What do I want out of the teaching exercise and so on and so forth? A couple of things have been very important in my teaching journey. One is I've always kept a teaching journal. It's sort of this freestyle, free-flowing thing that I've done right from the time I started teaching. It came in very handy when I started the PhD because my PhD was very much a normative personal inquiry turning into a larger structural critical one. It came from a place of these are the challenges I face when I'm teaching. Surely others must have similar, if not adjacent questions. Why don't I speak to others and find out what is it that they do in their teaching practices and journey? And that's where the journals came in handy. The other thing is, and we have spoken of this, is what does conceptual reorientation entail? It's one thing to, deliver content, what we call critical content, and then expect that content to be understood a certain way because one is simplifying it. It's another to understand what that actually means. So you're entering a classroom, which I see as this very reactive arena where different kinds of people are present. Nobody is a blank slate. So you're effectively witnessing an interaction between multiple institutions, social circles, your own, your students, the primary educational institutions that they inhabit, and the one institution that we bring with us everywhere, which is our families. So all of that is reacting, and you're not simply imparting critical content, you're witnessing different forms of reactions, social, political, and if I may, things that have been interesting to me of late, various kinds of neurological responses as well. So now I'm at a point in my work where I'm curious to find out through all of these parameters, what does conceptual reorientation entail? I'm very interested in what teachers experience, what are the challenges they encounter, how are they negotiating some of these challenges, and both teachers and teaching as these social beings and processes within other overarching process, where you present yourself as some sort of a knowledge imparting interface, but you're so much more than that. So I think those are two things that I bear in mind in terms of teaching some kind of an archive of who you've been through the journal and some sort of reckoning with what does something as profound as conceptual reorientation means. That's a lot, I realize. I,
Yeah,
I think I went off on a different tangent from your question.
no, I mean, there's a lot in there. I mean, I have a couple of questions. But first is, I think it would be good to just break down what you mean by conceptual reorientation. From what I'm getting, you're saying that, okay, in a classroom, people are, inhabiting multiple realities, they're carrying multiple histories, identities, thought patterns, and so on. And when you are offering some content, it's sort of, it's in an interplay with all of those different things, right? At any given point, you can't predict what's going to, play out. Is it going to be, let's say, a certain relationship you have with your family? Is it going to be some prior thing you have studied? Is it going to be, your socio-political identity? But when we are talking about critical content and critical content that has a socio-political sort of linkage, it will kind of provoke or evoke certain kinds of sort of responses which are unpredictable. Now, in that scenario, you are trying to do something and you're trying to sort of reorient how, let's say, they already think, or maybe the default ways in which they think. Is that what what you mean by conceptual reorientation? And it would be good if you can also give an example, let's say, from a teaching sort of moment where you are attempting to do this work.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that's a fairly accurate summary of what I'm trying to do. First, to the extent possible, I'm trying to understand what the default setting is. This in and of itself is very hard. And then I'm trying to see where I can take them. So clearly, like any teaching enterprise, mine also comes with an agenda. And I think mine is to just sort of question the givens that people work with and to be a little more inclusive, a little more subversive in the way they think about things such as knowledge, sources of knowledge. So I'll try and give you an example from my class about how this plays out. Um, in a law course, in different law courses, I think there's an assumption that law is to be fundamentally taught as doctrines plus cases. And very often, the understanding of what law is then becomes a shorthand for doctrines. So, no matter what level of law students I encounter, there is this very strong association between a structured, doctrinal, positivist understanding of law, that this is set, this is how it works. The only thing you can do with law is interpret it. And should you wish to change it, there's also a structure which follows a system and so on and so forth. This is not the understanding of law I work with. As in, if I was to show you my own homework over the last 13, 14 years, it's law has evolved to mean very, very different things to me. When I start out my course, this course called Critical Approaches to International Law, I ask my students to reflect on a series of questions. The first one I begin with almost always is, what is your relationship to the discipline of international law? This is week one. And very often, with the rare exception or one or two instances, I've always gotten the answer whereby students are describing a subject they are studying. It's a very typical description. International law is something that happens as between states, self-regulatory, etc., etc. But of course, does it really work? Because states are not accountable to anybody. So it's this interaction between IR and doctrinal law. And for them, the relationship is one of a subject they are studying or something they wish to professionally practice. This is how it always starts. This is a 14-week course. At the end of the 14th week, having gone through numerous iterations of pushing them to think harder about law, I come back and I ask this question again. And that's the last reflection paper. Again, invariably, the answer has made a paradigm shift. So, what starts out as this is a subject I want to study and practice becomes I no longer know what law is because all the certainty and the definitions I started with has dissolved. So, I think this is an illustration of what I mean by conceptual orientation, starting out with a doctrinal positivist understanding of law and moving on to thinking about law as institutional, law as social, law as processual, law as bureaucratic, law as affect, and all of that. And the journey is quite interesting. And the entire course is also punctuated with me asking them every now and then, how are you feeling about the course? This is also generates an interesting reaction because the first half of the course, students are usually articulating what they're thinking about the course as what they're feeling about the course. It's only from the second half that they actually start talking about their feelings, saying, you said XYZ in class and you destroyed the solidity of law for me. That troubled me. Or now, after 3 weeks, after 6 weeks, you're telling me international law is causing more harm than good. That upsets me. What do I do with this feeling? So it's usually this, and then this is a demanding endeavor for both the students and me. Um, and as for the students, I think the affective journey they make is okay, here we are now. This is what the subject looks like. What do we do with it? For me, increasingly, I think the focus has been that I don't want to leave them with this feeling of I've fallen off an abyss, and to come up with something a little more generative in terms of what I understand is now also a process of disillusionment, a gentle one, but disillusionment nonetheless. Um,
Okay, there was another question I wanted to ask about the teaching journal, but I want to ask it later now because I think what you said kind of, in a sense, follows into the next thing I was interested in, which is your PhD, right? So, what you're trying to do, like, how do you compare it with, let's say, some of the models that you have read about or observed when it comes to the teaching of law and specifically the teaching of international law? You could introduce your sort of PhD work a little bit. But from what I understand, you looked at this question historically, like how is international law taught, and you also went and talked to people and observed classrooms, right, to have more concrete understandings of how this is done. So, yeah. So, what's your PhD about, and how would you kind of summarize how typically or normatively law teaching happens?
you know what so my PhD is about how the teaching of a particular discipline called TWAIL or Critical Approaches to International Law is done. Again, as I said, I asked this question because these were questions I had of my own teaching. And my aim was then to speak to what I thought was a group of like-minded colleagues and see how they grapple with these questions. So, while it is indeed a project about how the teaching of international law is done, it's also very much a question of teaching is a social process happening in classrooms. When we say we are teaching a critical discipline, we're often doing a series of things we can't even account for, or working within a series of constraints that we don't often understand how difficult they are in terms of teaching. There is a historical component to it. I did look at A, the various ways in which teaching of international law has been done in different places, and B, the various kinds of scholarly literature that maps existing work on the teaching of international law. But that was a small part of my project. What I wanted to do was actually go out and sit in classrooms and speak to teachers. So, in that sense, it's very much an ethnographic project. Speak to teachers about what they think teaching is, what they think teaching in troubled times is, and particularly when they're trying to do some kind of social justice reorientation through their teaching. What I observed, and here I'm not talking about law teaching generally per se, I'll limit myself to international law because that's what the PhD is about, is it is very difficult for a law classroom to meaningfully account for the various kinds of politics that informs law. In part, this is because law has always been presented as a professional discipline, one where you go out and practice. So, two things happen as a result of this. Practice is presumably something you do in these places, namely a court, namely an international organization or an institution. Practice becomes a function of interpreting the provisions of law. Practice also becomes a metaphor for how do you work with other forces and powers such as bureaucracy. And then law becomes doctrines. What I've tried to understand in my work is even when people think differently about law. So, the earlier example that I give you is when I take students from law as doctrine to law as so many other things, I also introduce them to literature that talks about these things. So, there's something called the fourth world approaches to international law or indigenous approaches to international law that really push the idea of law, saying it's so much more than that. It's a way of life. Then there are feminist approaches to international law that talk about law as process, law as relationship. Now, what is interesting for me to see in classrooms is even teachers who genuinely wish to think of law in these ways often fall back on that schema of law as doctrine is what we must teach. A, because it's a neoliberal demand. B, because that's what students think laws are, or what often even teachers themselves seem to think is what a legal provision would look like. So, what I've encountered through my work is a lot of contradictions, a lot of conflicts, a lot of difficult feelings about what is it that we do when we teach a critical discipline, and a particular kind of mapping. And I realized what I ended up mapping was not so much how international law 12 teaching is done, but what are certain specific techniques we use to bring our own biographies into work. So then my PhD sort of became, a reflection on what are the most effective ways a 12 teacher is able to convey these deep social questions through the discipline of international law? How are some of the ways in which expertise in classroom is constructed by default, intentionally, and then how do these constructions of expertise both work against and work in favor of these various teacher figures? Then what do you do with this overarching thing that we're all working in, neoliberal academia, while you're trying to teach something critical? Not only are those regulations shaping your teaching content, they're shaping your teaching practices. Because every other day, and you and I are familiar with it, new institutional policies come into place, which has a direct bearing on our teaching. So how do those things interact? As a critical journalist teacher who also wants to teach your students that this is the world we inhabit, and my teaching ought to be able to tell you some truth about the world we inhabit, how do you then reconcile that kind of truth-telling exercise with the humongous constraints you're constantly working with? So that's sort of what my PhD ended up being, an account of different stories told by different 12 teachers about their different teaching journeys, of which, as the primary storyteller, I decided to pick and choose some stories, and some perhaps are left for another time.
Okay. Uh, but I think, for people who are listening in, it might be interesting to just understand, right, that what is law teaching supposed to be doing? I think so far you've given a sense of how to unpack teaching, right, and about the complexity of teaching. I don't know if it's necessary that, all of this is going into law teaching generally as
Yeah.
it is happening. I mean, I have no way of knowing that. You would know better. But of course, irrespective of institutional context and irrespective of what domain of law you're teaching, there is definitely complexity. And there are ways in which everyone's bringing their own sort of subjective beings, thought processes into it. There are ways in which the teacher and student are interacting. And in a sense, forming and building knowledge rather than simply, people, let's say, memorizing doctrines, right? But I want to ask a question about, like, if you had to generalize, right? And you may choose to not to also, but if let's say you had to say, okay, this is what law teaching is, right? Typically, and this is what law teaching should be or could be, right? How would you sort of answer that?
Um, Very broadly, overlooking a fair amount of texture and nuance, even within the generalization, the expectation is that law teaching will be doctrinal proficiency.
Okay.
And when I say proficiency, I mean both understanding and being able to read the doctrine, recognize what all the relevant doctrines are in terms of a particular area of law, knowing the cases, and being able to apply it somewhere. So the imagination here is of a legal professional.
Okay.
Whereas what I see, both in terms of the various complexities and contexts within which law is taught, three other things ought to be added to this idea of doctrinal proficiency. One is a deep understanding of where law is coming from and why it's a social process. Two, a processual understanding of how law works. Law works in different registers. It is not simply this, easy understanding of doctrine and application. Law works through bureaucracy. Law, and if you have to look at something like, let's say, the NRC, for instance, that's a fantastic example of law and the way it entangles with bureaucracy. Law works through relations. Law works through agents and people. So there has to be some sort of conversation around how is it that the law works rather than these easy transpositions. And the third one, which is what I personally find most interesting, and that's where the knowledge making aspect comes in, is what are the various forms that law takes? In the earlier model of teaching that I speak of, which is doctrinal proficiency, doctrines and cases seem to be the only form that people think law is capable of taking. Whereas a more critical interaction with law will tell you it can take many other forms beyond the scope of doctrines. So, if how it is taught is generally doctrinal proficiency designed to produce a legal practitioner, how it could be taught in a more meaningful, inclusive way for me then becomes including these three questions. Teach law in context, teach law as a generative processual enterprise, and think about what other forms laws can take.
And why is that important, right? Could you sort of spell that out? Why is that important for somebody who doesn't, who has no sense of, let's say, let's say how law teaching could be all of these things. And as you said, like, the typical expectation, even from outside the legal institution, is that, okay, you are training people to become professionals, right? And to become professionals, now we have a term for that, you need doctrinal proficiency. Now you're also saying that, okay, that is not enough, and there are these other things are required. So why is that important for the legal profession? And also, why is that important beyond, let's say, the question of whether the law should train only sort of people to become legal professionals?
I'll answer your second question first. Um, in my thesis, I also try to make the argument that the praxis of law is very much a process of socially engaging with law. So anything that has the power and ability to augment the meaning of law should be considered as lawmaking. In other words, it's not something that the legislature or the court is doing. It's also something that teachers are doing when they're in the classroom pushing the meaning of law. And in that sense, praxis or practice ought to include what happens in the classroom as well. This narrow institutional construction of practice, it may be institutionalized, it may be institutionally sanctioned, but it cannot be the only definition of praxis or practice. It's just the way you carry the law itself. So it's necessary because law governs big and small aspects of our life. Again, as I keep telling all my students of international law all the time, that when I ask them what is your relationship with international law, I also want them to think about the various ways in which international law disciplines them on an everyday basis, from what they eat to what they wear to the electricity meter outside their homes to how much mobility their passport has. Everything is governed by international law. So it's not just something you study or practice in institutions, it's something you live with. And that's an important context to have, and that can only come if you start thinking of practice happening in these different registers. So the first one, why is this important? You've engaged with lawyers. I don't know if this has been your experience, but there is a transcendental quality to the way law is perceived,
Could
as
you
if it
explain
is
that? Could you
something.
explain that?
Yeah. So law is thought of as this solid thing that governs you from above, but has no bearing on your day-to-day life. or it's something that shapes you but cannot be shaped by you. This is, of course, not true. But students come into the class with this understanding, and very often colleagues as well, that law is solid, law is unchangeable, it's transcendental because it's this, omnipotent thing, but you can't do anything about it. And that is such a terrible way to look at law. Not only is law a culmination of various kinds of social processes, very often it's a kind of a problematic manifestation of social processes where these sharp boundaries are made between who is and who isn't, who can be with law, who's often without law. So to then think of it as something transcendental, something so powerful that you cannot change is just fundamentally flawed. And I find that very troubling. And this is just something that I've seen throughout my teaching journey, in my conversations with students as well, that, or even lawyers for that matter, would say, no, but the law is saying this, as if it's unchangeable. And I think both of these ideas really, really need to change. And it's very possible in a classroom discourse, which is why I think these different sorts of teachings ought to be done. So, yeah.
But do you think that it, like, how do you think it sort of shapes the agency of the legal professional when they sort of go and work, within institutions which are normative and which have their own sort of limitations?
There's this very interesting piece of work by these two scholars that I really admire, Louis Islava and Sandhya Pahuja, and they've written something called Everyday Life of Trail. And a segment of it talks about three different categories of international lawyers. And each category is to be determined on the basis of their relationship with justice. So there are those who see law instrumentally. It needn't have any relationship to justice, whatever justice may mean. It's there, you apply it. Justice is a whole different entity altogether. This is your job, this is what you do. There are others who are a little more cognizant of the fact that law ought to have something to do with justice. Now, for them, law is the best thing to use in order to get to that sense of justice. So then they would now here I'm talking about the more social justice, human rights kind of lawyers who genuinely believe in the system. And then the third category, the more radical reformist variety, who understand that law is one strategic mode of attaining some form of justice. It obviously cannot be the only weapon in your arsenal, but one has to engage with it because so much of the world navigates around it. But there must be other ways to think about justice. And these three categories, I mean, the different kinds of lawyers move across these different categories depending on where they are in relation to this question of justice about a specific subject, conversation, or discipline. You would have the same person be very, very conservative about one domain of justice and then be incredibly radical about the other one. But this is largely the space that I see lawyers inhabit, both as legal professionals or as legal scholars or legal academics. I'll give you an interesting example from my most recent teaching episode. I was teaching what is the new law of crimes, the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. And we often ask in the questions that we ask the students in the assessment, you often present a hypothetical and you ask the student to represent a party as a lawyer. Now, what was interesting is, and that's a very standard question template. What that means is you find the best answer in that scenario. And this particular semester, I had several answers that were willing to defend the person at any cost. And I remember during one feedback session, somebody coming to me and saying that when you say represent this person, I thought you're asking me to be a lawyer, which means I have to find a way to defend this person one way or the other. And here you're telling me you're asking for a good, solid, analytical, academic answer. That is not reconciling with my idea of what a lawyer does. Isn't a lawyer supposed to defend their client at any cost? And I found that so interesting. And I said, different people make different negotiations as to what is a good lawyer. I don't know who you will be when you go out into the world. I hope someone who's able to make these ethical negotiations for themselves. But for the purposes of the class, I want you to be able to think with texture and nuance about different complex ideas. But it was a very interesting moment for me, for a student to come and tell me, your good answer may not make me a good lawyer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's interesting because that reminds me of something slightly different. I think even within Aaina, we have been working on this post and we've been discussing this post, which is on the limits of debating or using the debate as a form of, knowledge production and knowledge exchange. And we're not even talking about, formal debates, debating clubs. We're just thinking as a pedagogic tool. This whole idea, okay, there's an argument for something and against something, argument, counter argument, right?
Mm.
Uh, what are the limits of that? And I think one of the issues is that, uh, you know, that is one tool through which you can inquire into something, but that is one out of many, right? And in order to sort of explore the different dimensions of knowledge, you can't reduce it, to for and against. There are, as you said, there are emotional responses, there are, more philosophical responses, and also your ethical response itself is complex often, right? And the way you also present it, it can't always be an assertion. It can be tentative, it can be questioning, it can be reflective, and so on and so forth. So what you're also, in a sense, saying, and I'm just, getting a glimpse of your classroom, for example, that it's not a classroom where, there's just like a volley of like, claims, for and against, representing for and against. But it's an inquiry and it's a deliberation, and sometimes that is confusing and troubling, right? So I want to maybe end with, just coming back to teaching. And I was very curious about, the teaching journal. You said you've maintained it for such a long time. One thing I was very interested in is that how, what you're doing is so complex, and all, teachers do such complex work. Often it's daunting to just put it down in a journal. Like, how do you even do it? So very practically, like, what are some of the things that you do? Like, how do you document? How do you get the time to do it also? Because I think, especially with school teachers, right? I mean, we can say that home journaling should be done, except for the fact
Mm.
it becomes more work, more labor, and it's tiring. So
Absolutely.
yeah, so what is your approach to journaling? And I mean, as a teacher, I would also want to learn from that because I haven't really done it so much. So yeah.
Um, yeah, that's a really interesting question. I've been asked this question before, and since then I've been thinking about what is the best way to convey some of my journaling practices to others. But before I answer that, I actually very quickly wanted to go back to what you were talking about in terms of that debating aspect, and that connects to the answer about journaling. Personally, I find that form of debate very unproductive. And like you said, there could be many ways. And I'll tell you why I find it unhelpful. It completely does not account for the different modalities of learning and thinking that people have.
Hmm.
So, especially when you get into these very sharp exchange, and
Hmm.
even if the exchange isn't sharp, there is an expectation that you are able to draw from a wealth of information in that very moment. This
Hmm.
is not a style that works for everybody for numerous reasons, for physiological reasons, as I said, for neurobiological reasons. This may not be the mode of engagement that you wish to be in. And all of that aside, the one that connects to the journaling bit is sometimes you're asking a person to show you years worth of thinking, reflection, homework, and somehow just sort of filter that into one effective sentence for a debate. That is not how things work. And I think journaling made it very clear to me that there's a long arc, a long, complicated arc of thinking, which sometimes, translates into teaching, sometimes into writing. And a debate is probably the worst form to encapsulate this long and complex arc. And so I personally just find it the most unhelpful way to make if something's taken you that many years to nourish, nurture, reflect, and bring within you, how can you possibly just articulate it in a debate? So, and this insight I had looking at my journal. So, what do? I have different forms of noting things down. Some days when I have more time, and if it's a particularly good class, I try to write down what worked. And simultaneously, I write down how I felt about it. Now, the one thing that's consistent about all my journaling practices is noting down how I felt about that particular day, because it's an interesting indicator of how that particular mode went. So, there have been classes that I thought did not go well, but I discovered later that they were very useful classes for the students. So, it's usually two modes. One is what did I do in class today? I tried something new. How did I feel about this class today? It doesn't have to be a full paragraph. Sometimes I just jot down things. If I'm not putting pen to paper literally, that is my form of journaling. I usually, at the end of the day, I take 3 minutes if I must, longer if I can, and just write something down on the page about how teaching went that day. If that's not possible, I send myself a voice note. If that's also not possible, I type out notes. And then at some point, I sit together and I try to put them together and see what sort of themes are emerging. And I've been doing this for over a decade now. And I've also seen a difference in the style of journaling. Earlier, I was very, I want paragraphs to be in particular form and order. Now I'm a lot more functional. Now it's this worked today. This is why I think it worked. I will try this again later. Here's how I felt about it. So it's stringing together a series of ideas, and then I've seen it come together as my PhD. I'm seeing it come together as the next course that I'm about to teach. I'm also seeing it come together in our conversations and the other kinds of pedagogical work that I'm doing. But I think for me, it's just sort of both archiving my journey as a teacher, how I felt, the long arc, the different ideas I've grappled with, the different people that I have been. And then there's the content aspect of, oh, this is a good teaching technique. And then there's the, oh, I was a teacher of that nature in my early days. Here's who I am now. And here's how I've changed as a person. So honestly, if it's of course time consuming. And as you said, not everybody always has the time to do this. But if there's one thing that I would like teachers to do more consciously, more intentionally, is to do some kind of mapping, however erratic, of what sort of teachers they've become over the long arc of their teaching lives.
I think uh, I would want to try it out too. I keep thinking about it, I keep planning it, but I think I don't end up doing it. Uh, my final question is just like maybe just an open question. If there's anything you would want to, pass across to our audience, a large number of whom would be teachers, about something that they should sort of keep in mind or care about or think about as they navigate sort of educational spaces, what would it be?
My advice, well, no advice. I have no advice for anybody. I only just share my homework and see how that lands, wherever that lands. Two things actually. One is teaching is not a solo enterprise. No matter how it is presented to you, it just isn't. This is not one person's job. And rather than saying this as something that I think other teachers should do, I'm also saying this as an invitation. I honestly think as teachers, we should get together, talk about things that trouble us, talk about things that excite us, and do more teaching together.
Yeah.
Come into each other's classrooms, ideate on concepts and ideas, signpost them. And I say this very often to my colleagues, so far to no avail, maybe hopefully that'll change in the future, that there's so much we can do as social sciences faculty, as law faculty, as primary school teachers to come together and see that these are the ways we can think about teaching more generatively. So just to emphasize that it's truly a collaborative activity and should be treated as such. And the second, which I have personally found very helpful in my long teaching journey, is to, get past some of these limitations around what is knowledge. Even though, and again, higher ed teachers face this constraint a lot more than primary school teachers who have a lot more creative devices at their disposal and use it just as well. And this is also where I must acknowledge, having spent a lot of time with primary school teachers in the last couple of years, I think what they're doing is remarkable. We don't even come close as higher ed teachers. Is to get past this limited understanding of text as knowledge.
Yeah.
Knowledge is in your body. Knowledge is in everything around you, in the different ways one interacts with nature, the different forms one, engages with, be it music for you, be it painting for somebody else. I've been doing Tai Chi for nearly 2 years now, and that's taught me a lot. All of this is knowledge. All of this has to find a way into the classroom. So this project, which has kind of become my project now, to take different forms of knowledge seriously. I realize that within an academic institution, we can never take it as seriously as perhaps text or structured knowledge, but at least give it some amount of that intellectual due that it deserves is what I would like all kinds of educators to do.
No, that's really amazing. I mean, I keep thinking about this question, like what shapes or constitutes the knowledge of teaching, right? And in a very institutional sense, it people would say, oh, these are like frameworks of teaching or practices of teaching and activities that you can do and values that you have to imbibe. But actually, the knowledge of teaching is really sourced from everyday life and from the multiplicity that all of us are living through, right? The knowledge of teaching for you is coming from Tai Chi. For me, it's coming from music. It's coming from conversations, conversations that sometimes we are not even paying so much attention to. but there are ways in which they're playing out in how we are teaching. So I think those are two really, really good things to say. So thank you for that. And thank you so much for this conversation. It was a lot of fun and it was quite lovely.
Thank you. All conversations with you are fun. This in particular was much fun. And I also learned a lot from this very careful, thoughtful, attentive way in which you ask questions. So thank you.
Thank you.